Under the influence of players such as Kasparov, Gelfand, Shirov, Judit Polgar and many others, the King's Indian defence has become the most popular method of meeting 1d4. Instead of stodging around with some turgid Queen's Gambit or Queen's Indian, Black immediately gives notice that he's striving for the initiative, for the attack. When facing the King's Indian, it's very important not to back down. It's vital to fight fire with fire, otherwise you'll just get trampled on. The system that I'm recommending against the King's Indian has become known as the bayonet attack. As the name suggests, this is one of the most direct methods of meeting the King's Indian. This is an opening for the brave and fearless. The bayonet attack was originally popularised by the Soviet Grandmaster Mark Taimanov in the early 1960s, but in the 70s and 80s it fell out of favour. I'm not quite sure why actually. But a couple of years ago, the young Dutch player Luc van Welly started playing the variation again with excellent results. And since then, some of the world's most aggressive grandmasters have started playing the bayonet attack as well. For instance, Tony Miles, Johan Hjartarson from Iceland and Erik Lobron from West Germany. So we're in good company when you play the variation. We arrive at the starting point of the bayonet attack by these moves. 1d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6. Obviously these moves can be played in different order. c4, bishop g7, knight c3, black castles, e4, d6, bishop e2, e5, white castles, knight c6, d5, knight e7, and now the move b4. This is the bayonet attack. The point of b4 is to begin play on the queenside immediately. White wants to play c5, followed by taking on d6, so that the pawn on d6 is weakened and the c-file is open. In this line you keep the knight on f3. We'll see the importance of that later on. Normally white plays the knight back to either d2 or e1, intending to bolster the centre with f3. In order to explain why I'm recommending b4, it'll be helpful to see the kind of counterplay black normally generates in the main line of the King's Indian. Typical is Miles' Saxe. White plays knight e1. Remember, I'm recommending b4 instead of this move. Black plays knight d7, bishop d2, f5, rook c1, that's to prepare c5, knight f6, f3, white's pawn on e4 needed some support. Now black plays f4. Black is now trying to play g5 and g4 very quickly in order to open up the g-file. And white is going to try to play c5 and open up the c-file. Now, I like white's play here. White has an excellent space advantage with this pawn on d5. And very often in this main line of the King's Indian, white actually crashes through on the queen side, sometimes even takes a rook. But black doesn't care at all. Black is just playing for the attack, he's playing for mate. Let's see just how fast black's attack can be. White plays knight d3, black g5, c5, knight g6, c takes d6, c takes d6, knight b5, now that threatens to come in on c7, so black plays rook f7, white plays queen c2, threatening knight c7 again, so knight e8, a4, h5, now that's preparing g4, knight f2, that's stopping g4 again, bishop f8. Now it looks very passive that, but actually black is preparing, well we'll see in a moment. h3, again stop g4. Now, rook g7, coming to the g-file. Knight takes a7. Well this looks like a free pawn, because of course if black takes the knight then queen takes c8. So instead, black moves the bishop. And the knight comes back to b5. So black has lost a pawn, but really it doesn't matter at all. He just continues with the attack. Queen to b3, king h8, a5. Now black crashes through with g4. It's a very strong move. F takes g4, h takes g4, h takes g4, and now black just plays the knight back to f6 and is ready to recapture the pawn on g4. Knight c7. Now instead of moving the rook on a8, black simply captures on g4 and continues the attack. If white does now capture on a8, then black moves the knight into e3. If white takes, rook takes g2 check, king moves, queen g5, and mate is unstoppable. This is a really typical variation in the King's Indian. So Miles was forced to exchange pieces. Bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4, knight takes g4, and rook takes g4. Now there's a threat to the g-pawn on g2, so he must play rook f2. And now Sachs brings his queen into the attack. Again, white cannot take the rook on a8 because black simply crashes through on g2. So Miles had to play queen h3, defending the pawn on g2. Rook g3, queen h1, that's a miserable position for the queen. And now he moves the rook to c8. Bishop e1, bishop h6. Well, it's quite clear that black has assumed the initiative. He's ready to swing the other rook across to g8 to join in the attack on g2. And, well, white cannot be said to have any kind of attack at all. This queen on h1 looks completely ridiculous. a6. B takes a6, rook c6, rook g8, rook takes d6. Now f3, that's been hanging in the air for some moves. Rook takes a6. Well, I mean, this is just fiddling while Rome burns. I don't suppose white had any defence at this stage anyway, but this is just typical of the kind of attack that black can get. And now Sachs finishes off in a very neat way. Queen e3 check, bishop f2, rook takes g2 check. If the king moves to f1, then queen e2 is mate. So Miles took the rook on g2. F takes g2. Now, of course, if white takes the queen on e3, then bishop takes e3 check, and that's the end. King h2, and now Sachs gets the queen, and mate will follow shortly. Obviously that's not all forced, but I have a very uneasy feeling about these positions from white's point of view. I don't like it that the game is reduced to a race where my king on g1 is just a target for black's attack down the g-file. Whether or not black's play is completely sound is not the point. He's having all the fun in these kind of positions. Instead of wasting time moving the knight on f3 backwards, I think it's much better to initiate play on the queenside straight away before black has a chance to get going himself. That's why I like the idea of playing b4 immediately, trying to play c5. Now, c5 is definitely the break I want to play, because after I capture on d6, I open the c file, and also it means that the d6 pawn is rather weak now. So how should black react to this slightly unusual but very direct and logical move? In 99% of all games, black usually continues with his idea of punting the f-pawn up the board. Now to do this he's got to move his knight away, either to e8, to d7, or most critically to h5. I'll consider all these moves as well as the rarer idea of a5. The first move I'd like to look at is knight e8. Now black is pretending that nothing is happening that's any different, and white is continuing just as in the main line, but you'll see that white is in fact streets ahead with his queenside attack compared to the first game we looked at, Miles Sachs. So knight e8, white plays c5 straight away, black plays h6. Now the reason he's done that is before he plays f5 he's worried about white's knight coming into g5. Now immediately you see the reason why I've left that knight on f3. We'll be looking at this idea of white playing knight g5 a little bit later on. So after 10 h6, white plays knight to d2. Now that the pawn has moved to c5, he can manoeuvre this knight round straight away to the aggressive square c4. f5, knight c4, knight f6. Now white wants to strengthen his centre now, strengthen the e-pawn with f3. Black plays f4. Now this is exactly the same kind of attack that black is playing here as in that Miles Sachs game. But white continues a4, g5, bishop a3, knight g6, b5. Now you can see there's a threat of white taking that pawn on d6 with pawn takes pawn, and then knight takes d6. So black must play knight e8, defending the d pawn. Now white plays a5, black plays rook f7, and now this is a very fine move indeed. White plays b6. That's, as in true Nimzovician fashion, attacking the base of the pawn chain. So white has a very strong threat here of playing pawn on b6 takes pawn on c7, and if queen takes, for instance, then simply pawn takes d6 and you've won a pawn. So black must react in some way. So for instance, a takes b6, a takes b6. So the easiest way of defending against this threat is now for black to take on c5, d takes c5. So bishop takes c5. Now the rooks are meeting each other, so rook on a8 takes rook on a1, queen takes a1. Now black takes the pawn on b6, and white, well, could take with the bishop, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, knight takes b6. Now let's have a look at this position in a little detail. You'll see that black is a million miles away from getting anywhere with his kingside attack. He's not ready to play g4 at all. Normally in this main line black has the rook on g7 and that's obviously very dangerous, but here is a long way from that, and white has opened a great many lines on the queen side. His queen is coming down to a8, that's very dangerous indeed, and also white is ready to chop off at the right moment, chop off this bishop on c8, which is one of black's most dangerous attacking pieces. The other thing I want to look at is the difference between the two pawn structures. Now black's pawns, this isolated pawn on b7 will potentially be very weak indeed, and also the pawn on e5 as well later on. But the most annoying thing from black's point of view is that he doesn't have any pawns protecting his king any longer. Now in the long term this could be fatal, whereas white's king is perfectly safe. And of course if we look at white's pawn structure, there's not a weakness there. The base of the pawn chain, g2, really can't be attacked for the moment. And of course the most beautiful thing about white's structure is that pawn on protected passed pawn on d5.
I only managed to find one game from tournament practice with knight e8. It's hardly surprising. I find the move much too passive.
More often, if black is going to retreat the knight, then it'll be to d7, because it looks as though this move holds up the pawn break c5. Knight d7 looks like a good move because it seems to prevent c5, but in fact, and this is one of the nice things about the whole system, white can crash through anyway with c5. So black takes pawn, white recaptures, pawn takes pawn, and black plays knight takes c5. Now white plays bishop a3, attacking the knight. So if the knight moves back, say to d7, then black is caught in a very nasty pin from the bishop on a3, and then white simply plays rook c1 with some very nasty pressure against c7. So black is almost forced to play b6 here. Now if we can follow the game Liebert Postler from the East German Championships 1971, we'll see how quickly white's pressure develops against black's queenside. So after b6, white plays rook c1. Black lashes out with f5. He hasn't really got much else to do. White plays bishop takes c5. Black recaptures, pawn takes c5. Queen b3, and that's a nice move, threatening d6 check, winning the knight on e7. So king h8 is almost forced. And white calmly brings the rook from f1 to d1, just to strengthen his centre. Now, white is simply threatening to take the pawn on c5, maybe queen to c4 takes c5, and then black's pawn on c7 is also a terrible weakness. So this pawn sacrifice c5 is really only temporary. He's going to get these pawns back anyway. Let's see how the game went. Rook f d1, f takes e4, knight takes e4. Black brought the knight to f5. White played knight takes c5. Knight d4 from black. Knight takes d4, e takes d4. Bishop f3. Bishop f5. Queen c4. White has a wonderful position here. His forces are beautifully centralised. The rooks on d1 and c1. And black's pawns on c7 and d4 are terribly weak. For instance, there's a simple threat here of just bringing the knight back to b3 and knight takes d4, and also queen takes c7. This is a fairly typical position that one might get from this line. White has tremendous pressure against black's position. Knight d7 is a move often played by people unfamiliar with this line, but in fact it gives white excellent winning chances. I like it that white gets involved in hand-to-hand fighting immediately. Black is already on the defensive. Before we look at the critical continuation knight h5, let's see what happens if black doesn't challenge white's space advantage with f5 and go for a kingside attack. There are a couple of other moves. Perhaps black could play c6, but then again that seems to be playing into white's hands by opening the queenside already, and the same goes if black plays a5. For instance, white could simply play bishop a3, then if pawn takes b4, white recaptures, bishop takes b4. c5 is still threatened. Well, let's suppose black plays b6 to prevent that. Well, then white can play a4 and a5, again breaking open lines very quickly on the queenside. I feel as though I've already won the psychological battle, because the centre of the struggle is now on the queenside. And where's black's attack? Knight h5 is theoretically the recommended move. It looks terribly active. Black is threatening to bring the knight to f4. Well, that's a bit near my king, so I don't like that. And also black is preparing f5. Now, one rather common move by white in this position is to play c5. But, as I said before, I don't like this knight coming into f4. After it comes there, well, it'll either take that bishop on e2. Well, I don't like to give that bishop up, and it's just in a dangerous position. So after c5, knight f4, white often just takes the knight. Bishop takes f4, e takes f4. But I don't like to do this because that bishop on g7, the long diagonal is now opened. And also, black may simply build up some attack on the king side by playing h6 and g5, and then bring the knight to g6. And, well, I think black still has an attack. It doesn't suit me at all. So I actually prefer, after knight h5, just to play g3, stopping the knight coming into f4. The point of black's play is to continue with f5, but now we see the point of leaving the knight on f3. After f5, I can play knight g5. This is the move that really characterises the whole variation, and this is very tricky indeed. After knight g5, I'm threatening bishop takes h5, winning a pawn. So black must put the knight back on f6. Now, I have to support my centre, because black is threatening to play pawn takes e4. So I play f3. Having the knight on g5 is rather unusual. It looks as though black can play h6, attacking the knight, of course. Then white plays the knight into e6. So black must capture this. Bishop takes e6, d6. Now we have a very strange position with this pawn here on e6. It looks as though black ought to be able to win this pawn somehow, but in fact it's very difficult indeed. For instance, if black plays the obvious queen c8, then white can leap in with knight d5. That's a very unpleasant move indeed to meet. Now, obviously, if black captures this knight on e7 takes d5, then I'll play e takes d5 with a protected passed pawn on e6. I think I can be quite confident about that position. And of course, if black takes the pawn on e6, queen takes e6, I'll play knight takes c7, winning the exchange. So suddenly black is in a bit of trouble. So he could protect the knight on e7 by playing rook e8. But then I've got a very nice move indeed. I'll play bishop d3. My threat is to play knight takes e7 check, rook e7, and then take on f5. This is the point of the variation. This is why it's rather nice playing this knight g5 into e6. If I can get rid of that light squared bishop on c8, then black has very, very bad white square weaknesses on f5 and g6. So black has to do something about this f-pawn. It's possible to play f4 here, but I'll simply take that pawn off. G takes f4, now e takes f4. Now it looks as though black is setting a trap, but I'm going to walk straight into it. Bishop takes f4. Now if the f knight takes on d5, I'll play e takes d5. Now it looks as though black can just take this rook in the corner. Bishop takes a1, queen takes a1. Now I've given up the exchange, but I have a crushing attack. This pawn on e6 really drives a stake through the heart of black's position. There's no connection at all between the queen side and the king side. So I have a mating attack. My threat is to play bishop takes h6. So let's see, if black plays g5, I can just play queen f6, and if pawn takes bishop, I'll play queen takes h6, and there's not a lot to prevent me playing bishop h7 check. King goes to h8, bishop comes back to g6. Then queen h7 check, king f8, and queen f7 mate. You can see from that variation that it's really not so easy to get at this pawn on e6. In fact, it seems in a lot of the games you'll see that black spends half his time trying to take it, and even when he does, white has such tremendous compensation because the white squares are so weak that it really doesn't matter. But in many of the games, this e-pawn actually survives for a very long time. This line was actually very popular in the early 60s. Black players found they had to be a little bit more subtle about the way they went about trying to win the pawn on e6. So after h6, knight e6, bishop takes e6, d takes e6, c6 was the move commonly played, just to prevent white's knight coming into d5. And then white usually played b5. This is simply to open lines on the queen side with b takes c6, b takes c6 and rook b1. If I can refer you to the games Schmidt against Hübner from Skopje 71, and also to the game Taimanov-Gligoric from 1960, which show how excellent white's compensation can be in this line. Problem is that black finds that this move f5 he's played earlier on is rather undesirable, because his king can actually become very exposed indeed. But there's a problem with this move b5, and that is f takes e4, f takes e4, queen b6 check, king g2, and then queen d4, and I can't see how to get out of this. So the knight on c3 is attacked, and also the pawn on e4. Now if queen takes d4, e takes d4, and now when the knight moves, let's say to d1, then black can simply play knight takes e4, winning a pawn. Or if queen c2, black plays knight takes e4, and if queen takes e4, then queen takes c3. Alternatively, if knight takes e4, rook takes f1, bishop takes f1, and now black just captures the rook in the corner. White should definitely avoid this line. b5 is a good move positionally because it opens lines on the queen side, but it just fails to this tactical response, queen b6 and queen d4. Perhaps I'm overlooking something. If I have, then this would still be a good line to play. But because of this weakness on the diagonal, this queen b6 check, then actually most players nowadays are playing bishop e3 instead of b5. Black can play f4 here. I don't really want to take this pawn. If g takes f4, e takes f4, this opens up the line of black's bishop on g7. If I took the pawn with bishop takes f4, then black could play knight h5, attacking the bishop on f4, and also opening up the line of the bishop on g7, so that the knight on c3 is attacked. Now the only move to save both pieces is bishop d2. Then black could play the knight into f4. This is very dangerous for white indeed. I don't like opening up the position in that way. So after f4, I could simply play bishop f2. Black can continue with knight e8. Notice that black still can't go after this e-pawn with queen c8, because I'll just play queen takes d6. So knight e8 actually threatens queen c8 and also knight c7, bringing the knight round to attack the e-pawn. But don't worry, all is not yet lost. White can play queen b3, so that if queen c8, then c5. This defends the e-pawn adequately, and also opens up the lines of the bishops on e2 and f2. We've actually transposed to the game Miles-Shirov. Now Tony played a superb game. Let's look at it in some detail. Shirov took on g3 here. F takes g3. And Miles recaptured h takes g3. That's by far the best recapture. The two pawns together provide the best defence for white's king. Shirov played knight c7, attacking the pawn on e6. Now you see how Miles manages to defend that pawn by tactical means. He played rook a d1. That's a very nice move, looking at the sensitive pawn on d6. If Shirov plays knight takes e6, then Miles can play c5, threatening queen takes e6 check, and also rook takes d6. That would blow black away completely. So Shirov played king h7. That's a very sensible move, getting the king out of the line of the queen on b3. But Miles played c5 anyway, threatening, well, pawn takes pawn, winning instantly. Now, Shirov really only has one move here. He could defend the pawn on d6 by playing knight c8, but then I'd play pawn takes pawn, knight takes d6, and probably, well, bishop c5. That looks really crushing. The pins on the queen on d8 and the rook on f8 look very nasty. So really, black must play d5 in this position. Miles captured the pawn on d5, and Shirov recaptured with the pawn. Let's see what happens if Shirov plays knight e takes d5. I think white should play bishop c4 here, just threatening simply to take the knight on d5. If black plays knight takes e6, this actually transposes to the game later on. We'll see that in a bit. But black can play rook takes f3 here. Now this is getting rather critical. White, I think, can play a fantastic queen sacrifice here. Knight takes d5. If black plays pawn takes knight, then I'll just play queen takes the rook on f3. So rook takes queen. I'll play knight takes c7. I'm threatening rook takes queen. Rook on d1 takes queen on d8. So black must play queen takes c7. I'll just recapture the rook now with bishop takes b3. So what's the score? White has a rook and a bishop for the queen, but his most important trump is this pawn on e6, which is very well protected by the bishop on b3. White's threat is to play rook d7, attacking black's queen and cutting right through black's position, pinning the bishop on g7 and supporting the e-pawn as well. It looks like the most obvious move for black is to play rook d8, but then I'll exchange rook takes d8, queen takes d8, and play rook d1, queen g5, and now rook d7, again cutting right through black's position on the 7th rank and threatening e7 and e8. I'm fairly sure that Shirov would have seen this sacrifice and thought better of it, and that's why he played pawn takes d5. It looks as though black's centre is secure, but this is the point where Miles crashed through with knight takes d5. Shirov played knight e takes d5, and now bishop c4, and because of the pin, white recovers the piece. So black plays knight takes e6, bishop takes d5, rook takes d5 is also possible actually, and Shirov must play knight d4, and Miles took this off with a bishop. Bishop takes d4, e takes d4. Looking at this position, we can see that white stands clearly better. Perhaps white's best piece in the position, apart from the queen on b3, is the bishop on d5. This is a superb piece. It dominates the light squares all over the board, not just in the centre. In the game, it finally came to rest on e4, and Miles constructed a battery by playing the queen back to c2, battery against g6. Now that's extremely unpleasant for black, as his king is lined up there as a target. Later in the game, Miles crashed through on the light squares. Tony Miles' play in this game is exemplary. You could do much worse than follow his play here.
Miles' play in this game was not a one-off. All the same delicious ideas, the open lines for white's bishops and rooks, can be seen in the game von Gleich versus Stangl.
The bayonet attack really wasn't seen very often in the 70s and 80s, but has recently come back into fashion through the games of the young Dutch player Luc van Welle, who's had tremendous success on the white side of this system. Here we see he plays John Nunn, arguably Britain's leading expert on the King's Indian defence, but he completely blows him away. After f3, Nunn played f4. Now this is a very committal move indeed. I'm really not sure about the merits of this move. Van Welly played very carefully King G2 here. I think that's a very good move. There's an old game that was played with B5 here. That's anticipating black playing C6. But now black actually has a very clever drawing combination here. If black plays F takes G3, white plays H takes G3. Now H6, knight E6, bishop takes E6, D takes E6. Now black can play Queen C8 here. White must respond with knight D5, but then black plays Queen takes E6. Now it looks as though knight takes C7 is going to win the exchange, but then comes Queen H3, and if knight takes A8, the rook on A8, then Queen takes G3 check, King H1, Queen H3. Well, black has at least a draw anyway. So that's why Van Welly cleverly played King G2, preventing that. And also taking the king off that rather sensitive diagonal. We've already seen how the queen can come out to B6 to check the white king on G1. So King G2 is a very tidy move. It also protects G3. Nunn also played a very tidy move. He played King H8, taking the king off that diagonal. The queen, as we've seen, often comes to B3. But now, Van Welly played the move C5. That's the move we're trying to get in right from the very beginning. Nunn played H6. Now, instead of playing the knight into E6 immediately, let's have a look at what happens if white plays knight E6. Then black will play bishop takes E6, D takes E6. And I think black can play D5 here. That looks a bit unpleasant for white. And if pawn takes pawn, then knight takes pawn. And it looks as though black has freed his game. So cleverly, Van Welly didn't play knight E6 immediately. He played pawn on C5 takes pawn on D6. Now, if pawn takes pawn, then I think knight E6 could be quite good. If bishop takes C6, pawn takes E6. Now, if white has time here, he'll just play queen B3, rook D1 with a crushing position. He's held the pawn on E6, the pawn on D6 is weak. So I think really the only move to try and get anywhere for black is to play D5. Now, I could just exchange all these off, all the pieces off. I think that's probably quite good for white actually. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, knight takes knight, and perhaps bishop c4, or perhaps bishop d3 attacking the weak pawn on g6. Instead of taking on d5, white could also just play queen b3 as well. I think it's going to be very difficult indeed for black to get at the pawn on e6. So if white holds that pawn, he automatically has a very good position. So instead of pawn takes d6, Nunn took with the queen. And now Van Welly seized the initiative with knight b5. If queen takes pawn on b4, then knight takes c7. That is a very nice move indeed. Attacking the rook on a8. So if pawn takes g5, knight takes a8. And if rook b8, then crash, knight g to e6. Those knights are absolutely fantastic. So Nunn can't take on b4. But he has to keep hold of the pawn on c7. So he played queen b6. Now, Van Welly played a4. If Nunn takes the knight on g5, then that queen is in big trouble. It's almost trapped. Plays a5. Queen must go to a6. And then knight takes c7. And knight takes a8. So after a4, Nunn played knight f takes d5. Pawn takes knight. And then he took on g5. Now the reason he's done this is that after a5, which Van Welly played, the queen has the square on f6. Fanweli took on c7. The rook must move to b8. And now this next move is very fine indeed. White basically has a very good position here. The d pawn is very strong. The knight on c7 is going to be protected by the pawn when it comes to d6, so that's in a good position. But none is threatening to get a bit active here with maybe a bishop to f5 or a knight to f5. Fanweli played g4 here. As well as closing the king side so that White's king is in absolutely no danger here at all, this prevents any piece going through f5. Knight f5 and bishop f5 are prevented. After this, Fanweli had complete control and he went on to win a really nice game. In view of White's excellent results against c6 and h6, Black has been playing a5 recently in several top level games. But to be honest, I don't know why this move is popular. It looks like a load of rubbish to me. a5 merely opens up the queen side. That's exactly the sector of the board I want to be playing in. The game Hjartarson against Yurtayev from the last Olympiad in Manila is really rather typical. White kicked off with queen b3. This is a key move in the whole variation. The queen points at b7 and also at the king on g8, and also gives some support to that pawn on e6. It's not there yet, but it will be soon. Black played b6. That's in anticipation of the bishop having to take the knight on e6. And also, Black is trying to hold up this move c5. White played bishop d2. I actually had this position in one of my own games a couple of weeks ago. Instead of bishop d2, which I think is a good move, I actually played knight e6 immediately. So my opponent was forced to take it off. Bishop takes and I recapture with the pawn. And then he played king h8, getting his king out of the line of my queen on b3. That's a sensible move, because if he'd played the rather tempting knight c6, because he wants to come into d4, then I could play c5. Then if knight d4, I have e7 check. And if knight takes b3, I take the queen on d8. Black must recapture. Rook takes queen on d8. And I play bishop c4 check, winning the knight on b3. Instead of taking on f5, I just played bishop d2, which is okay. And after rook a7, I played queen b5, with the idea of coming into d7. Black played h6. Well, I'm not sure about that move, but he wanted to stop my bishop coming to g5 eventually. I played a4. I want to play a5 and open up the position on the queen side. He played knight ge7. And I played queen b1. And I've got to admit, I chickened out. As I was rather short of time, I offered a draw, which my opponent took. But perhaps even better than queen b1 was to play queen d7. Now the continuation c6, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and knight b4 is quite plausible. And I wasn't sure about this position because I couldn't quite see what to do. But if I'm not sure what to do, then Black is really stuck. Black can hardly move any of his pieces. The knight on e7 can't move because I'll play knight takes c6. The knight on c8 has no squares anyway. The pawn on e6, well, it's almost impossible to capture that. I don't see how it's possible. And eventually I can actually just play this position very slowly indeed. Perhaps play rook a2, rook a1 and play for a5. After rook a2 I can also consider the plan e takes f5, g takes f5 and g4, winning even more control over the white squares. In short, I think white has an excellent position, almost winning, I'd say this ending is. Back to bishop d2 and the game Piaterson-Yurtayev, who continued from this point rook e8. I think he's preparing to meet this move knight e6, perhaps hoping one day to pick off the pawn on e6. Now Hjartarson continued with this move bishop d3. Just as in the previous example, this is a critical move. This is very nice indeed. Black is really very sensitive on this diagonal after the knight comes into e6 and whips that bishop off on c8. Black continued bishop d7. I'm not sure about that move. It seems to waste the tempo because black will have to take off the knight on e6 anyway, so it seems rather strange. a4, that's a nice move. Eventually you want to break open with a5 on the queen side. The rook will have to move back soon because of the bishop on d2. Black played f4. He's clearly worried about that diagonal and the pawn on f5. White played knight b5, so bishop on d2 attacks the rook on a5. Now, black actually left this rook to be captured. Let's see what happens if black moves the rook back to a8. Now white can play a5, breaking open lines on the queen side. If black plays b takes a5, then I'll play bishop takes a5, attacking the pawn on c7. Well, if black plays bishop takes knight on b5, then instead of recapturing immediately, I'll play knight takes e6, crushing move, and then just recapture on b5. But obviously white has a winning position here. The knight on e6 is too strong. And if instead of bishop takes b5, rook c8, then knight takes d6. It's a very nasty move. So taking on a5 looks to be impossible to me. So if h6, let's have a look at that one. Then I'll play a takes b6. Now rook takes a1, rook takes a1. H takes g5. Now I'll play knight takes c7. So I'm threatening the rook on e8. Rook f8. Now rook a8. That's a very nasty move indeed. Black is almost forced to give up the queen here. If bishop c8, then knight e6 is going to win. And if knight c8, well, I move the knight first and then b7, that wins. So black must play queen takes a8, knight takes a8, rook takes a8. Now b7, black must play rook b8, and now I crash through with my move c5 again. That's why in many positions black anticipates this kind of move and puts the king on h8, because here obviously black can't take on c5 because of d6 check, winning the knight on e7. So white has a winning position here. c6 is threatened and the pawn on d6 as well. It's completely crushing. Having seen how nasty retreating the rook would be for him, black decides to leave the rook there on a5 and play bishop h6 instead. But white soon wrapped the game up with g takes f4, e takes f4, and bishop takes a5. And after pawn takes bishop, he just played the knight into e6, bishop e6, d takes e6. White is the clear exchange up here and went on to win the game very shortly afterwards. So far we've seen a lot of games where black has had problems on this diagonal, the b3 to g8 diagonal, when the queen moves out there. So it seems to me that king h8 is a very sensible move. This has been played in several games and actually involves a rather devious trap, which was pointed out to me by our expert Dr. John Nunn. If white now plays bishop e3, black plays f4. Now, taking this pawn in this position is incredibly risky, because black can play e takes f4, bishop takes f4, knight h5. Okay, only way to save the piece, bishop d2. And now either knight f4, or probably better than that, bishop e5. This is very dangerous indeed. Black has this clamp on the black squares on the king side, and the attack will be very potent indeed. So normally the response after f4 is to drop this bishop back to f2, as we've seen already. It looks very solid indeed. But now black can actually force a draw by playing bishop h6. White must play the knight into e6. Bishop takes e6. Pawn takes e6. Now, f takes g3, h takes g3, queen c8. Now it looks like the standard response to this is knight d5. Well, it's the only move that makes sense. Now black can play queen takes e6, knight takes c7. Looks like it wins the exchange, but now queen h3, knight takes a8. This is very similar to a variation we looked at earlier, but where's black's perpetual check? It's not there. But he has the move bishop e3, fantastic move. If bishop takes e3, then queen takes g3 check, king h1, queen h3, and there's the perpetual check. And there's nothing that white can do to stop that. After bishop e3, this is practically all forced. So instead of that, the correct move is to play king g2, just giving that g3 pawn a little bit more protection. It's a very strong move. From this point, the game, Luc van Welly, him again, against Matthias Valls, a very strong German player, continued knight e to g8, and that's a very mysterious move. I think he wanted to give the queen a square on e7. He was perhaps hoping to take the pawn on e6, but he doesn't have time for that. Van Welly played c5. Now queen e7, and lucky Luke is just in time to play queen b3, protecting the pawn on e6. It's not there yet, but it will be soon. Black played his knight to e8. I'm not really quite sure what black's doing here. Perhaps he just ran out of ideas. White played the knight into e6, bishop e6, d takes e6. There you are, solidly protected by the queen on b3. Obviously, black can't capture on c5 because white recaptures, and if queen takes c5, then bishop a3. So black played c6 in this position. Well, that's preventing white later on playing the knight to d5. White just brought his bishop to e3, very sensible. Soon he'll be able to take on d6 and play the bishop to c5. Now, this is a very good illustration of what happens when the position opens. The bishops are just fantastic. Black is in great trouble here. So he decided the best thing to do was just to give up a pawn. He played d5. But Van Welly just took this off. E takes d5, c takes d5, and queen takes d5. After knight f6, the queen just went back to b3, and white was a pawn up for absolutely nothing. No compensation at all. Unfortunately, Luke went on to lose this game, but really from this position, it shouldn't have been that difficult to win. I must admit, there's one move which I was slightly concerned about, and that's rook e8. I've seen a couple of games that have gone c5, now h6, knight e6, bishop takes e6, d takes e6, and now d5. And it seems to me that black has good counterplay in the centre. So instead of c5, I wonder about the move b5. Now that looks rather a strange move, but really I'm preempting the move c6. Now if h6, knight e6, bishop takes e6, d takes e6. You'll see that the move b5 has taken away the square c6 for black's knight. Black wanted to play knight c6 into d4, an excellent square. So the knight's only square now is c8. Now if knight c8, threatening rook takes e6, I can take advantage of the fact that black has moved his rook from f8 to e8, because now f5 is rather weakened. I'll play e takes f5, g takes f5, and bishop d3, so that if rook takes e6, I'll play bishop takes f5. Now black is terribly weak on the white squares on the king side. So instead of rook takes e6, if black plays e4, a critical move, I have to give up material. F takes e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop e4, bishop takes a1. I'm giving up a whole rook here, but I think my attack is strong enough. I'll play queen h5. And I don't see a defence for black in this position. His connection, the connection between the queen side and the king side, simply, well, it doesn't exist because of the knight on c8. Just blocks things up. I think I have a winning attack. If you're not convinced by that, I'm not sure I am completely. We need a few practical tests on that one. b5 is interesting, but if you're not convinced by that, just before making this recording, a German magazine arrived in the post with the game Mr. Stork, or probably Herr Stork, against Mr. van der Erf, which went queen b3 after rook e8. A very sensible move, of course, on the line, on the diagonal towards black's king. Now black played a5. I'm not sure about that move. And white took it. Black played h6. Knight e6, obviously. Bishop e6, d takes e6. Now black played knight c6. Very sensible move, bringing the knight round to the excellent square d4. Now I think in this position white could continue just by playing e takes f5, g takes f5, bringing the queen back to b1, attacking the pawn on f5, and if knight d4 then bishop d3, and the pawn on f5 is bound to fall. I think white would have good attacking chances then. But instead of that, white played c5, threatening a very nasty check with e7. Black moved the king out of the way. Now he put it to the square h7. I think h8 would have been much more sensible. On h7, that's moving it into this critical diagonal, the b1 h7 diagonal. As we've seen, black has tremendous problems because that light squared bishop has gone, so he can't protect it very well. White played e takes f5, black recaptured, and now I think he should just play the queen to b1 immediately, going for f5 straight away. Instead, he captured on b7. Black played knight d4, and then he brought the queen back to b1. So in a sense, he has lost a tempo for the attack. Now black played something very reckless here. He should probably cut his losses and play the king back to h8. But instead he played e4, a very risky move indeed. And after f takes e4, knight takes e4, white crashed through with rook takes f5, very strong indeed. If knight takes f5, then queen takes e4. After rook takes f5, black played knight takes knight on c3. But now white forced checkmate with a fantastic move. Rook f8. Check from the queen on b1. And if knight takes queen, bishop d3 check, only move knight f5, bishop takes f5, and that's a rather beautiful mate. And punishment for black for having given up the bishop on c8. By now this position should be quite familiar to you. It arose from a bishop e3 variation, but in fact white can now transpose to some of the older games that we discussed earlier by playing b takes c6, b takes c6, queen a4, queen c8, rook a b1, queen takes e6, and rook b7, which are quite promising for white. In fact, in the game Garcia-Palermo-Gallagher, white now played queen d2, attacking the pawn on h6. Surprisingly, I think black should have just given this pawn up by playing queen c8, bishop h6, queen takes e6. Chances are balanced. White doesn't have the pressure down the b file as in the other variation, but material is equal. But Joe Gallagher played king h7, protecting the h-pawn, a move that looks sensible enough. Garcia-Palermo played rook fc1. Black took on e4, white recaptured. And black played the very natural move queen c8, attacking the pawn on e6. But this was the move that white had been hoping for. B takes c6, b takes c6, and now the wonderful move, knight d5. If queen takes e6, then knight c7 wins the exchange, as we've seen in many other variations. And if pawn takes knight, the c-pawn takes on d5. Black's queen is attacked. There's only one square to go to, b7. Now surprisingly, when black plays rook a to b1, black's queen is trapped. Gallagher saw the coming trouble and decided to give up a piece instead, but he soon lost. It's a fiendish trap, which I'm sure many players would fall into. This line is a nice illustration of white's space advantage and the power of the two bishops.
It's worth playing over all the games in the booklet to try and recognise the recurring themes, in particular the weakness of the light squares. You'll probably notice that there are a couple of games there which weren't mentioned in the video. Lobron-Gelfand, for instance, which black won. But don't worry, if you look at that game closely, you'll see it's actually terribly good for white. There's also another game, Van Welly against Reindemann, which theoretically perhaps isn't so interesting because it involves this idea of c6 and queen b6 check, which I think might be good for black. But I've included it because it's such a fantastic game. It's really wonderful ideas from Van Welly. Perhaps we can sum up by saying that the key to white's strategy in the Bayonet attack is activity. Even if you lose this pawn on e6, you'll find that you'll get compensation in open lines for bishops and rooks. Or perhaps you can take the pawn on f5. The Bayonet attack has chalked up an impressive list of victims so far. For me, the finest game is actually Van Welly against Nunn. I think he played that game terribly well. It's interesting that although knight h5 is recommended by the books as being the most reliable method of meeting Bayonet attack, in fact, John Nunn, after losing to Van Welly, said that he studied the opening in some detail, but couldn't find a way for black to neutralise white's initiative. The Bayonet attack has been given the highest seal of approval.